Well, good morning, everyone. It's great to see you virtually. I'm Peter Betts. I'm chairing the panel today. I was a UK official for many years, including lead negotiator for the European Union in the climate talks for a long time. We've got a great panel today from a very diverse range of sectors, and they're going to talk a little bit about the sort of challenges and the opportunities that they see coming out of Glasgow. Maybe just a short word on Glasgow before I turn to them. I think that the headline from Glasgow, which generally accepts, is it made a lot of progress, but not enough. So if you look on the mitigation side, the emissions reduction side, if you look, practically all of the big developed economies, except Australia, went to the very top end of what I at least thought they would do in terms of their emission reduction targets. They're very challenging targets. None of them are remotely on track to deliver those targets. So if they're serious, there's a lot of policy coming down the track which businesses are going to have to deliver on. Then if you look at the big emerging economies where most of the emissions now come from, hardly any of them raise their ambition, with the exception of South Africa. Very modest changes of ambition, improvements in ambition from them. So if you stand back and think, what are the priorities for this year? I would say, on the one hand, make sure that developed countries deliver their targets, and the second, hope that we can encourage the big emerging economies to raise their ambition. I have to say, even before the Ukraine crisis broke, I wasn't that optimistic that was going to happen this year. So that was the sort of mitigation piece. On finance and adaptation, unfortunately, developed countries didn't meet their target to mobilize $100 billion a year. They did, however, commit to doubling adaptation funding over the next 4 years. And I think there was a much more of a focus on adaptation than we've seen in the past, which was encouraging. Finally, there was a huge sort of plethora of sectoral announcements by businesses and by coalitions, which I think really, are potentially very energizing and provide a lot to build on. So, certainly in all my contacts with business, I am really struck by how sort of energized businesses are at the very top level about delivering on the climate agenda. But I'm also struck that as they really get into thinking about how they're going to deliver some of these really ambitious targets that they've set themselves, that there's some really hard questions that they're grappling with. It's not easy practically to deliver on these targets. And I hope we're going to get some insights from this great panel today on how on some of the ways they can best do that. So let me come to the three panelists. I'm going to ask each of them to speak for about 3 minutes, and then we're going to come to a bit of a discussion at the end. Let me come first to you, Emma Howard-Boyd. Emma is the chair of the Environment Agency, but also many other hats, but including a UN climate ambassador, global ambassador for COP26, and very much a thought leader on adaptation. Emma, I mean, my perception is that adaptation hasn't always had the focus it deserves over the last 20, 30 years. I think that has really started to change in the last couple of years, partly thanks to your efforts. But it still feels like it's a bit behind mitigation. Could you give us a sense? Do you think businesses have understood the scale of the adaptation challenge that they're facing and that they're gearing up to respond to it?
Thank you. And it's great to be joining this conversation, and great that you're directing the first question to me, because I think you're right, Peter, that very often adaptation and resilience has been the Cinderella subject alongside the drive to net zero. And in my UN role as one of the ambassadors to the races to zero and races to resilience, I found myself very much focusing on the race to resilience. The Environment Agency is the environmental regulator in the UK with jurisdiction over England. We also have responsibility for flood and coastal erosion risk management. And I think it is in that part of our work, very specifically, that we have seen an increasing need for not just government, local government, public services, but also private organisations to start to grapple with the need to adapt to the changing climate. No matter how urgent and how much focus there is to the net zero agenda, and really great to see the progress at Glasgow, really great to see the $130 trillion announced to align to net zero by 2050, we know that we have climate change locked into the system for the next couple of decades. And just the events that we've been experiencing in the UK over this winter shows us how quickly we need both government and private sector organisations to prepare for those climate shocks. As we were all heading to Glasgow, we saw trains disrupted. The Environment Agency had flood warnings in Cumbria. We've had Storm Arwen back in November. And just earlier this month, the end of last month, we had the Met Office naming 3 storms in swift succession over a period of a week. Right in the middle of COP26, on the eve of Adaptation and Resilience Day, we had the Hull Barrier, the Boston Barrier, and the Thames Barrier quietly doing their job, closing overnight against one of the highest tides of last year, protecting millions of lives and livelihoods against flooding. And this is where we all need to get ready to invest in preparing for climate shocks. And that can be too much water, too little water, too hot, too cold, and fires, often seeing those happen in swift succession, often overlapping. And if we take the recent storms where we in the UK were experiencing high winds alongside flooding, we know that the investment that we at the Environment Agency, funded by government, put into flood preparedness meant that although we saw around roughly 400 homes very sadly flooded in England, we saw over 40,000 properties better protected because of the investments that have been made over the last decade. And that's why it's really promising to see initiatives like the Coalition for Climate Resilient Investment, which is co-chaired by the John Haley, formerly of Willis Towers Watson, Samir Asaf of HSBC, and I represent the public sector. We have something like 25 trillion assets under management, made up of both asset managers, civil engineers, governments, looking at how we embed into investment decisions preparedness for climate shocks. From what we know that we're going to experience, confirmed in the recent report from the IPCC on adaptation, we need to get ahead of the climate emergency without limiting our urgency to also meet our net zero commitments.
That's great, Emma. And you mentioned the CCRI, the Coalition for Climate Resilient Investment. I mean, one of the things that shows is, first of all, it's not being resilient doesn't necessarily cost as much as you think. But secondly, when you really understand and can quantify the additional value you derive from that resilience, then what should happen is you should benefit from a lower interest rate in the borrowing for your infrastructure. And when you factor that in, it may not be necessarily more expensive to build in a resilient way. Is that a fair assessment, a summary of CCRI?
I think that is a very fair summary. the earlier we are designing into our infrastructure build resilience factors, the more value for money and cost effective it's going to be. If you just take the UK, there's a publication that was produced in September last year by the Infrastructure Projects Authority. It sets out a construction and infrastructure pipeline for this decade, some £650 billion worth of infrastructure build, roughly 50-50 due to be funded by both the public sector and the private sector. If you look at the government's flood budget within that 650 billion, it's roughly 5.2 billion. It's a thin green line of defence. We need to make sure that all of that infrastructure is built to the climate that we're seeing and ready for those shocks, and making sure that that infrastructure doesn't become stranded in the future, literally being washed away in a flood or melting in a heat wave.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. That's great. Doug, maybe I could come to you next. Doug Sabo, Chief Sustainability Officer at Visa, and also a long and distinguished career in different sustainability roles in business. I mean, maybe you could talk us through a little bit some of the sort of barriers and the challenges and how you've overcome them in Visa on the low carbon agenda.
Yeah, I'd happy to. First, thank you, Peter, and thank you to The Economist for hosting this overall event and this session. I think as someone who had the opportunity to represent Visa at COP26, at first, I think your opening is spot on. Our observations are great momentum, but not far enough, not fast enough, but still a lot of new announcements, a lot of new commitments being named, and I think a real galvanization of those that the COP26 event happened to play a role in. Now, at Visa, we are a global payments technology company, relatively a lighter footprint company ourselves, but we are taking the actions that we need to take in order to bring sustainability into our operations and to decarbonize what our business looks like. A couple areas that I want to just touch on real quickly and some of the challenges that these have been for us. I think three challenges. One, in the area of Scope 2 emissions, purchased electricity. So we have completed a transition to 100% renewable electricity, but we want to continue on the journey to bring even more additionality into the grids in places where we operate our offices and our data centers. It's been challenging. It's been a combination to achieve 100% renewable. It's a combination of advocating for greater renewables in the grid, to enrolling in utility programs, to our first long-term solar agreement that we signed last year. But it's challenging. And I think the more that companies like ours as energy purchasers can have friction removed from that process, I think the easier that transition will be. I think second, Scope 3, our business travel.
Removed? What do you mean by friction removed, Doug? Sorry to interrupt.
Yeah, no, happy to touch on that. I think for us, it is the combination that we have to become, in many cases, energy experts in order to transition to renewable energy and beyond where I think we would want to go. I think we would want this to be as straightforward and easy as possible. The more renewables in the grid, the better it is, the easier it is for us. Or for us, we happen to lean toward utility programs. And so the more that utilities are offering us options, whether it's baked into the grid or it's an additional program that you're enrolling in, those are easier. The virtual power purchase agreement process is very complicated, and there is a limited number of companies, I think, who have the internal resources and expertise in order to execute those complicated agreements. So those are some quick points of friction that I think that we've experienced. And we do want to bring more additionality. So we're looking at the roles that we can play. I think on the Scope 3 business travel, our business travel remains paused, but we know it'll come back, and the aviation part of that certainly has a footprint to it. We think sustainable aviation fuel will play a key role in decarbonizing aviation overall. We are on board that pun intended. We're on board that journey. We signed the Clean Skies for Tomorrow commitment around supporting the whole ecosystem of sustainable aviation fuel. We enrolled in the United Airlines Eco Skies Alliance, actually committing to pay the premium for sustainable aviation fuel for part of our travel. But now we're looking in other parts of the world, and there are limited options today. And I think that's the inherent challenge around the supply side of SAF. And then the final challenge is for a type of company that we are, is that other part of scope 3, the purchased goods and services, the supply chain. Now, we're not manufacturing, we're not agriculture, but we do have thousands of companies from whom we purchase goods and services as part of our commitment to net zero emissions by 2040, which includes our supply chain. As part of our science-based target that has been submitted to the Science-Based Target Initiative, we have to bring those suppliers along with us. And while we have been participating in the CDP program around supply chain for our largest suppliers, very quickly you get to small and medium enterprises that just don't have sustainability teams, that don't have the resources. And I think large multinational companies and others who have thousands and thousands of these types of companies in their upstream from them in their value chains really need to work together and really help bring those thousands of companies, if not millions of businesses, on the journey as well. So just a couple quick challenges. Then there's a whole area of what are we doing outside of our operations in the world of commerce and consumption that we play a role in, and happy to share a little bit more about that in a few moments.
Thanks a lot, Doug. That was great. I'm gonna, for reasons of time, I'm gonna come straight to Duncan. I'm gonna come back to you on that important point you just raised later on. So, Duncan Burt, who is Chief Sustainability Officer at National Grid and has had many other roles at National Grid, and before that worked in the pharmaceutical industry, both in engineering and in sustainability. He's worked. So, Duncan, it's great to have you. The energy sector's, probably ahead of many other sectors in terms of, decarbonising. A lot of the technologies are there, they're replicable, and yet even in energy, we're going to have to have a prodigious increase in the scale of rollout of low carbon energy. Maybe you could say something from the point of view of your standpoint of, what are the big challenges and, what are the conditions for success to be able to deliver this massive scale up of low carbon energy?
Yeah, Peter, we definitely feel at the sharp end of this, as Doug's pointed out. It's not all straightforward buying energy, and we'd like it to be as easy as possible for Doug in his role, particularly in our footprint. So you're right. The UK is the fastest decarbonising economy in the G20, largely due to the rapid decarbonisation of electric power, and after that comes electrification of transport, and then on to low carbon heat, much of which will be certainly in the UK electricity. And we really are expecting, the jog of the last 10 years. It felt like a sprint at the time, but it now feels like a jog. Really turns into a hard run globally for the next 30 years, and it will be pretty relentless as we go through first electric power and then transportation and then heat to get there. In developed countries, as you say, we are expecting a tsunami of policy where it isn't yet there to provide that commercial structure. We're seeing some really positive steps in that. In transportation, we're actually seeing the market begin to take the lead now, with electrification of vehicles becoming the norm, and those big supply chains now, particularly for Europe and North America and some parts of Asia, really beginning to go pure electric in the next 5 years. And actually, often the UN measures progress by policy, and I think in stuff like transportation, it might have to take a different view because the market will really run ahead. And I think that will provide some more optimism to some of the concerns you've got coming out of COP. Now, those concerns are right, but I do hope that some of that can accelerate away. But globally, we've seen a really positive program launched by the UK and South Africa to try and put its arms around a whole program of issues there to help decarbonise the energy sector. Positive steps from Germany with its presidency of the G7 now to muting similar schemes for some of the other really significant nations like Indonesia. And we're really keen to see the Green Grids Initiative, One Sun, One World, One Grid, kick off. Very significant program of events in India as well. But, these are all small subcomponents of what needs to become an enormous, unstoppable delivery machine over the next 30 years as we shift towards electricity and shift away from oil and gas.
That's great, Duncan. Very, very, very interesting. I mean, when I read some of the sort of studies of what needs to happen, they suggest that globally, to be on track for 1.5 degrees, we need to quintuple the rate of rollout of renewable energy globally every year for the next 10 years at least. That means many more raw materials, copper or lithium. It means more manufactured components, many of which come from China. But it also means, in democratic countries, looking at planning systems. Often planning systems, it takes a long time and for good reasons, to get things through. And I saw the Germans announce a sort of a relaxation of some of their planning rules recently. I mean, can you say something about what you see as the sort of as the real barriers to scale up, and what you think would really help in the UK or in other jurisdictions, if you prefer?
Yeah, I mean, I'll start with planning. Planning and consenting appears to be an issue everywhere. There's a big surprise for us to go to COP as a principal partner and come away with, some of the challenges. Obviously, you see, in the democratic planning process in the UK or in Germany or in the US are replicated really around the world. And we saw that in South Africa, in Laos, in Vietnam, when we talked to colleagues there. In fact, Kenya probably had some of the best examples of how to really take communities with you and get around this. But it's a big issue. In the UK, we've got new national policy statements this year, which we hope will provide a really concrete foundation to then engage regionally and locally to deliver some of that infrastructure. You've touched on, the rate of supply chain growth that we need and some of the minerals and critical supply elements that come with that. We are confident that that can grow rapidly with the kind of market certainty and regulatory commitment that should come from policy change. So there's a lot to do, and there's a big role for business to both argue for that with policy and regulators, for us as a regulated business, but also then to help underwrite it and to provide the right structuring for that to come through. And the money in terms of capital markets, we think, is there, again, for the right contracts and the right products in place. So generally positive. Part of the challenge for governments in this is putting that all together into a coherent package so that you've got all the pieces of the pie that you need in order to get on and deliver this.
That's great, Duncan.
Could I come
very,
in
very
here?
Interesting. Please do, Emma.
So I think, building on what Doug's just said, and although this will feel a bit UK specific, I think it is relevant around the world. It's really clear to me that with this being the decade where we really need to crack on with our net zero plans, our climate resilience plans, our nature recovery plans, that we also need to make sure that different types of regulatory bodies, as well as different departments, are working as closely as possible and in sync over different time plans that phase in 5-year cycles, etc. So the environmental regulators need to be in lockstep with the economic regulators and the financial regulators, right, so that we're working in alignment as opposed to against each other's and the timelines that we've been working to in recent years. I think that is critical for this next phase.
I agree that's a very important point. Thanks. Maybe I could come to you, Doug. I mean, you talked very interesting about what Visa is doing within its own operations. Of course, you also provide finance to lots of customers, and I know you've done a lot of work on thinking about how you can encourage some of your customers to move in that direction. I wonder if you could say something about the business case for that, because I'm sure there are some in your organisation who would ask questions, and how you take your customers with you on that. So over to you.
Yeah, sure. Happy to address that, because I think at Visa we really see a very clear business case for us to take urgent climate action, and to do so not only within our own operations, the areas I was talking about before, but in the overall world of commerce and consumption and sustainable living, and the transition to a low carbon economy that we know is upon us. And it's a business case that is both about value preservation, so risk mitigation, as well as value creation. We see just as much in addressing downside risk as we do the upside business opportunities. I think we agree with Larry Fink of BlackRock and the UN and others who've said climate action is one of the greatest economic opportunities that we will face. For us, If you think about the risk mitigation side, if no action is taken, then we'll have more of what Emma described at the beginning. We'll have more of the record mega storms, we'll have record wet or record dry, wildfires. I mean, any of these items that are disruptive to the world of commerce and economic activity and communities and lives and livelihoods. And so that is a risk to the business if that happens. On the other hand, there are, as urgent climate action is taken, and some of the shifts to, say, electric vehicles away from internal combustion engine vehicles, to threats to travel and tourism with flight shaming and other trends that were taking place. I mean, these are phenomena that are also risk to payments volume. And so rather than hiding from them, we think it's an opportunity for us to lean in on those. And so we are working together both in ways to embed a better connection for consumers and businesses between their spend and the footprint it has. So we have some offerings out to our financial institution clients to turn on to their consumer and commercial customers that really help understand, all right, this was your purchasing, this is the footprint and estimated footprint it had, here's some other greener behaviors that you could adopt. We're also leaning in on different verticals, from working with 400 transit agencies to coming back to that topic, removing friction from taking public transit, looking at and working in the electric vehicle charging space and bringing open payments to those networks, as well as playing a role in sustainable travel and tourism. All of these map up to areas that are important payments volume for us as a company, and also areas that we think that we can be part of the solution and meet our clients and their expectations of what they're looking for, as well as to be a relevant brand for millennial and Gen Z consumers in particular, both as consumers as well as employees. So we do see a strong business case, both from that risk side as well as the business opportunity side.
Great, that's very, very powerful. We've only got a few minutes left. One of the events that's happened in the last few weeks is tragic events in the Ukraine. I wondered whether Duncan, we've seen some politicians express concern about Europe's dependence for energy on Russia, and therefore seeing renewable energy as a source of energy security. Is that something you think will have increasing traction?
Yeah, that's right. I think it's early days still, but we think it really is likely to be transformative, particularly for European energy over the next few months. And that is taking energy much more balanced in terms of security and resilience and zero carbon. And actually all of those three things come together in the form of a rapid build out of renewables and really accelerating that European journey to net zero, with a very high renewables, with a mix of nuclear and some other low carbon technologies grid. And that actually in the short term may involve perhaps a bit more gas and a little bit more coal in Germany, combined hopefully with some nuclear extensions as well. I think I'm more relaxed about that if it's very short term, for two reasons. One, if it results in a huge charge, an accelerated charge in Europe towards renewables, that can only be good for really getting emissions down for 2030. And also, a lot of that gas which isn't going to Europe is probably going to China and offsetting what would have been coal burn over there. So we might actually get a double whammy effect. That's speculation at this stage, but generally it will be galvanizing, I think, for European energy markets and accelerate their transition.
Great, excellent. So we've got a minute and a half left. I'm going to give you each 30 seconds for any final thoughts you want to offer. I don't know who wants to go first. Emma.
I'll maybe just build off, perhaps, Pete. And,
maybe Duncan, please.
I need to pick up Emma's point, really. I think it's that joining together of some of those things that Emma's talking about with regulators. That kind of whole government action is really, really powerful in terms of then galvanizing markets and getting business mobilized and pointing at the problem. We're seeing that really positively, in Europe. We're seeing it again now, starting in the United States as well with the Biden administration's plan. So more of that joined up approach and clear policy is vital.
Thank you very much. Emma, quick word from you.
It would be fantastic if COP26 went down in the history books for the time in which the financial markets leaned into the decade of climate prosperity and really used the power of finance to look at investing in a net zero, climate resilient, prosperous future.
Fantastic. And Doug, final thoughts from you.
Sure. I'll just bring it home with, not only do we need the decade of urgent climate action, but we really need a decade of radical collaboration. And picking back up on the stakeholders, we do need that collaboration from the role that governments can play, the private sector can play, civil society, the NGO community, and at the end of the day, the billions of citizens around the world that we need to engage and bring on the low carbon economy transition as well. So I think this is a decade of radical collaboration needed that lies ahead of us.
Fantastic. Well, thank you for the three tremendous speakers today. It's been a really interesting conversation. Thank you for listening, and stay tuned for the next session, which will begin shortly. Thank you very much.